Okay, thank you everyone so much for being here. We're absolutely thrilled to be able to do our fall Eminent Scholars Lecture virtually via Zoom today. As you all know, we do the Eminent Scholars Lecture once in the fall semester and once in the spring semester to bring some really great big name scholars to UCF and share some of their research and their insight with us. And so today I am absolutely thrilled to say that we have Dr. Mary Guy with us as our eminent scholar that will be lecturing today. And I'm sure that most of you know many things about the record of Dr. Guy, but let me just give you a brief introduction. Dr. Guy is, of course, a professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her teaching and research focuses on human processes involved in public service delivery. And on that topic, she's written widely about social equity and emotive demands of street level work. She also writes about workforce diversity and the difference that gender makes in policy development and implementation. Very important topics and the reason we invited her to join us today. Dr. Guy is also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, past president of the American Society for Public Administration, past editor-in-chief of the Review of Public Personnel Administration. She's received numerous awards for her research, her leadership, her mentoring, including the Waldo Award, the Van Riper Award, the ASPA-NASPA Distinguished Research Award. And prior to joining the School of Public Affairs at UC Denver, she held the Jerry Collins Eminent Scholar Chair at Florida State University, no doubt in preparation for this lecture today of the same name. And before that, she served as department head at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And so in case you have an interest in some stocking stuffers or gifts for the holiday season, some of Dr. Guy's recent books include Achieving Social Equity, the Palgrave Handbook of Global Perspectives on Emotional Labor and Public Service, Essentials of Public Service, Public Administration Evolving, and Emotional Labor and Crisis Response. And so Dr. Guy is going to give us some remarks today. We're going to ask everyone to just hold their questions until the end, and we will monitor the chat. If you'd like to pose some questions in the chat once Dr. Guy is finished with her remarks, we can go through those questions, and we will also, of course, ask people to ask questions verbally in person once Dr. Guy is finished with her remarks as well. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Guy, for being here. I turn the floor over to you.
Well, I am delighted to be here, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. And hello to all of my friends in Orlando. I wish I could be there in person, but COVID had other plans and we played with the cards we're dealt. So let me just share my screen and talk you through some slides I have for you. As students, as teachers, as practitioners, as researchers, our job is to advance civic leadership. That's what we do. And to do that, we have to advance social justice. We must make the change that we want to see. So what I would like to do this morning is lay the foundation for you for social justice and for achieving social equity. And as I do this, as you have questions, please post them in the chats. And when I conclude my remarks, then I look forward to a Q&A session. And let me also tell you that I love political cartoons because I think they catch the essence of so many of our public problems and quandaries and issues. So I have scattered them through my slides, and I hope you enjoy them the way I do. So let me get started. First of all, we've been talking a lot about social equity and achieving social justice for some years, but along comes COVID and it just acts like a huge magnifying glass. It shows us all of the inequities that are so embedded in our system that we sort of take them as normal. And in fact, they're not normal. And it's as if this problem has become an opportunity for us to look more clearly at the inequities that exist and to ask ourselves what we can do in our own programs and in our own scholarship to address these head on. I'm going to talk to you about the architecture of inequity because I think it will help you see how embedded the inequities are. And I'm going to close with the punchline that we are accountable and we are responsible. When I think about achieving social equity, I think about it in terms of the individual commitment and the institutional commitment and the organizational commitment it takes to identify inequities and to achieve equity. And that requires management to make it happen. And it requires paying attention to outcomes. Because if you, no matter what you're doing, if you're not producing equitable outcomes, you're not helping the situation. So here's a formal definition of social equity. This is what was put in place by the National Academy of Public Administration, and it pretty much captures the entire wide array of dimensions to the issue. So you see here that it's social equity is the fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions, both serving the public directly or by contract. It is the fair and equitable distribution of public services. It is the implementation of public policy, and it's the commitment to promote fairness and justice and equality and equity in the formation of public policy. So it's management, it's commitment, it's implementation, it's all of these things together. So we're talking about social justice. We think it's important. The Me Too movement has happened. Black Lives Matter has happened. And then along comes COVID and really shines a light on things at a time when we have the time to think deeply about these issues. You know, every problem is a challenge and every challenge is an opportunity. So perhaps we can get some good out of what we are going through. But think about it. Here, this is what this fall has been like. It's not the usual pumpkin spice season. I mean, nothing is working quite as it should. Schools are upside down, they're closing again. Hospitals are overflowing. Death rates are skyrocketing. Pay cuts and furloughs are going on across the country. Businesses are closing. Rents are due. Jobs are scarce. This is where we are. Things are not okay. And we are social beings. We are hardwired to be with other people and to engage with others and to talk with others, to laugh together, to share our joys, to share our sorrows, to share all of our frustrations. And that's not going on. And it's pretty much making us nuts, but that's the way it is. So we're isolated, we're sort of uneasy, we're on edge, we're uncertain, and that's what we are. And in healthcare, we've been talking about pre-existing conditions for a long time, but culturally and socially and governmentally and economically, we have pre-existing conditions also. We have the economic inequality. The Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too movement has really helped us see the inequities that exist for gender and for race. And at the same time, from a huge macro look, neoliberalism has sort of, you know, it's on its last breath at this point. It has exhausted itself, and we're seeing all of the failures that it has brought with it. So that's where we are. So to move away from that and think, how can we achieve social equity? There are four main dimensions to it that when taken together can really help move things forward, move our programs forward, move our processes forward. And that deals with procedures, access, quality, and outcomes. By procedures, we're talking about that which we all know, due process and transparency, but it's equal rights, it's also representativeness. It's also having good rules in place. Access means have people having opportunity to participate in those decisions that are going to affect them. Quality means having programs that are worth having, that meet standards. And outcomes means really producing equitable public services. This is a slide you probably all have seen some variation of, showing the difference between equality and equity. The Constitution talks about equality. It is far easier to understand and to measure that which is equal than it is to understand and see and measure that which is equitable. And let me show you this in a more specific way. This slide shows you the nuances to equality versus equity and how social justice is sort of what we're really trying to achieve. Inequality happens when somebody's just real lucky and happens to be on the side of a tree where the fruit is falling. Equality is when we may give everybody the same height ladder to reach the fruit, but someone may still not be on the side of the tree that produces the fruit. So on equity, you see the thing to do is to raise the ladder so that everybody can reach the fruit. Justice is putting the supports in place, the systemic supports in place that maintain an equitable access, equitable distribution, and equitable outcomes. So here's a slide I really want you to pay attention to. We sit in our living rooms and everything is perfectly normal. Our lives are pretty good. And this is what seems normal to us. But it seems normal because it may well be perpetuating the precise inequities that we're all aware of. And that's because of the architecture of our societies, the architecture of our communities, the power structures, the systems about whose voices gets heard. That's what's behind the walls of our collective living room. So it is the rafters, it's the joists, it's the joints, and it's the floor supports and what's under the floor that really produces the shape of this living room. When we are in our living room, when we are in our programs, when we are implementing policy, we must look not just at the lovely walls that are already constructed, but in fact, what is behind those walls? It's that architecture that we have to look at again and make adjustments to if we are going to achieve social equity. So for my friends on faculty, look at what we are handing to our graduates. It is a world on fire. It's America on fire. Things are volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and it's up to us to help our students figure out how to look at this constructively and how to take action. So when we think about social equity, it's like a basket full of words that come tumbling out. And it's easy to say these words. It's easy to talk the talk. But what I hope you will leave this session with is understanding the importance of walking the talk, whether we're talking about fairness or equality, whether we're talking about immigrants, we're talking about hunger, we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about healthcare. We're talking about race, we're talking about cisgender issues, we're talking about LGBTQ issues. Whatever perspective we're taking on it, we must have the words, but we must have the actions that follow up. So let's talk about essential workers for a minute. Remember back in March when all of a sudden the whole nation was hit with the go home and stay home orders? And each of us as Americans thinks of ourselves as pretty self-sufficient, but it became immediately apparent that we are not self-sufficient, independent actors. There are so many essential workers that we take for granted: the delivery guys, the trash pickup, the grocery store clerks, the emergency medical squads, law enforcement, firefighters, city engineers that make sure the water stays safe, the teachers, call takers, sanitation workers, you name it. We are all in this together. And we really need to pay attention, not just to the decision makers, who are on the 13th floor in the lovely offices, but the essential frontline workers. That's where the real public service happens. So imagine this: if in our textbooks, in our theory, in our practice, if we turned that pyramid upside down, and instead of focusing on the decisions made at the top, if we really paid attention to those delivering those services, imagine the difference that would come with that. So back to COVID. Here we are. Dreams are dashed. Things aren't going as we had planned. Jobs aren't there for our graduates. We talk about a V-shaped recovery. We talk about a V-shaped recovery, but in fact, it's a K-shaped recovery. Those who were doing well before COVID are doing very well now. Those who were not doing well before COVID are really suffering now. It is a K-shaped recovery. So economically, there are tremendous implications for what we're dealing with. We have watched on our television screens lots of the Confederate memorial statues coming down, and we feel kind of good about that. We applaud it and say, we're moving on from this racist history. But in fact, that the systemic racism is the social architecture that shapes our collective living rooms. It's the systemic racism that we must always pay attention to. It's not going to be enough to just talk the talk, and it's not going to be enough to just remove some statues. We have to pay attention to all of those systems and all of those rafters and all of those supports that perpetuate the system that we have. We're making a little bit of progress in terms of paying attention to First Nations. It's only taken the nation a few hundred years to realize Indigenous peoples. We've been talking about environmental justice, and with climate change, we will continue to talk about it more and more and more. But the results of climate change have a disproportionately deleterious effect on those who are already disadvantaged from the rest of the architecture in our system. We've made some progress on LGBTQ rights. There's been some significant pushback during the last several years. It's the nature of moving toward a more equitable society is not linear. It is not a straight upward line. It is always met with progress and then pushback. But we mustn't be dreamers. We can't just sit in our lovely living rooms and think something's going to happen to change this. We have a system that has been put in place over several hundred years. And it's not until each of us takes on our own responsibility in our research, in our scholarship, in our teaching, in our practice to really make the change we want to see. And one thing we can focus on immediately is to stop fooling ourselves to think that objective gender or objective neutral measures are really neutral. In fact, it was the Griggs versus Duke Power decision back in 1971 that showed that neutral processes, in that case, requiring tests for anyone who wanted to be promoted at Duke Power Company, had a disparate impact on those workers who were already disadvantaged. And so the Supreme Court said that's not legal. But it's, if we look at our rules in our programs and see where the disparate impact is, that opens the door for us to talk more about changing those neutral tests that we have in place. For example, look at what's happening with the incredible popularity and utility of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence algorithms are great. They're helping us go through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of kinds of information. But those algorithms are only as good as the assumptions of the researcher who puts them in place. So we have to be smart about the algorithms. There are socially appropriate terms that we use that cause us to feel good about rules that actually have disparate impact. For example, I was watching Amy Coney Barrett's testimony in the Senate, and she was asked about whether there are limits on who should be allowed to vote. And this has to deal with felons, felons who have served their punishment and then having the voting rights restored. Some states do it. Some states do it honestly. Some states sort of do it like Florida and then slap a huge cost on the person. But Barrett's response was that there was such a thing as a virtuous voter. This is a frightening thought, because I suspect we could sit around a conference table and disagree on what virtue is when it comes to voting. So let's be careful about those assumptions that we take for granted and assume are all equitable, because they're not. So when we think about gender or talk about neutral rules, oftentimes we'll say, well, this is a gender neutral policy. Usually that's not the case. Gender neutrality in this nation typically means rules that will favor males. Racial neutrality typically means rules that will favor those who are white. Sexual identity will be rules that basically favor those who are cisgender. In terms of neutrality with nationality or ethnicity, it's whoever is in the majority group. Whoever makes the rule for what is neutral is typically making those rules in a way that advantages them. So be smart about your rules. Take a look at them. I'm going to show you just a list of items that I think of as levers for how to move forward toward a more equitable society. One is, regardless of how one identifies, racially or sexual identity, however you identify, think of yourself as an ally or as an advocate. You don't have to be the one who is disadvantaged by a system to really be an ardent ally for them and an advocate for social equity. Pay attention to the feedback from the programs that you are administering. See if they truly are having equitable outcomes. Appreciate the power of effective rules. There are good rules, rules that provide transparency, that provide predictability, that make it possible for everyone to participate in equivalent ways. And be alert to your own inherent privilege, because to be self-aware is to then be more other-aware. Own the responsibility to move social equity forward. Be accountable, be responsible. When there are decisions being made that are going to affect different constituencies, ask yourself, are those constituencies at the table? And be aware about whose views predominate. If you have representation around the table, but it's only those in power positions whose views predominate, then you're not getting the voices, you're not hearing the viewpoints of everyone at the table. And look around the corner. Look again at the architecture of your program, of your rules, of your system. In other words, don't just look at the walls in your lovely living room. Look at what's holding them up. So here's my work plan for you. Be comfortable engaging in crucial conversations. I was speaking with a city administrator in Norfolk, Virginia recently, and I asked him what he has been able to do to really bring disparate neighborhoods, communities together. And he said it's so important for them to talk, but he says, we can't just schedule a meeting in City Hall. People have to be able to have those conversations at trusted events. It may be community centers, it may be gyms, wherever there is a high trust level is where the best conversations can come about. We need to be thinking about reconciliation. We need to be sensitive to others. Madeleine Albright recently she was advising the Congress, and she was suggesting that it's time for us to reintroduce the idea of America. Well, I would say let's reintroduce the idea of America through the lens of social equity, because that's really what we want to achieve. That's what we hold up as dear. And the more we can give that words, I think we can help all of us understand that we're all moving in the same direction. We're trying to achieve an harmonious diversity. That's the American ideal. That's the American dream. So I encourage you to move away from the founder's notion of white male privilege. That's the architecture of the system we've been working in. And it's not working well for women, and it's not working well for people of color, and it's not working well for many immigrants. So let's think again at that. Let's grow up a bit. And here's a slide that grabs me because our culture is so fissured. It's as if there is a chasm. It's divided clearly. Just look at the results of the most recent election, and it's dramatic how perceptions differ. I hope we're not headed towards a civil war, but we're certainly closer to it than any other time since Abraham Lincoln took office. So let's be smart about this. The points I want to leave you with are these. Be the change you want to see. No one else is going to do that for you. It's on you. Be critical of that which you take for granted. Look beyond your walls. Look at the supports in the system. Look at the rafters that need to be changed. Speak about your work in words people understand. Explain and defend equity. Make it important to others, just as it's important to you. And lean in. Lean in. Be accountable. Be responsible. And remember that the path is not linear. It's not a job to get done and then wipe your hands and think everything is fine. It won't be, because there is always pushback. That's the nature of power, and it comes with. It's part of what statecraft and governance is all about. And there are setbacks and there are partial victories. That's what it is. what statecraft is. That's what we are committed to in our work. That's what we're committed to in our studies. And to be good at it, we must be aware of the architecture that is shaping the rooms in which we are all now sitting. So let me close my comments here and ask you to ask me anything you want to ask, or make whatever comments you want. I'm wide open.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guy. Our Associate Dean for Research has discovered this button that has a round of applause that I feel like I should have implemented for this, but I don't have that. So you will get my applause alone. I see Claire gave you, and Justin are giving you applause as well. So what I'd like to do is, if you have questions, perhaps it would be easiest to raise your hand, and then we can call on folks if I can see them. And certainly, Dr. Guy, if you see someone's hand raised, or if you want to look into the chat, I will let you field the questions if you feel comfortable, or I can jump back in.
Well, let me see.
Are you able to see the chat?
Yeah, I'm just now.
So I can cue you to two questions I saw pop up.
Why don't you do that? That'll be faster.
Okay, question one is, do you have any advice on having crucial conversations in virtual settings?
Wow. You know, it is, if Zoom has taught me anything, it is that no matter how good the visual is, there is something missing in the spontaneity and the connection, just in the eye contact, face to face. I don't think, you simply, we cannot electronically duplicate what we have face to face. It is, you know, Zoom is better than nothing. You know, being able to look at someone as we speak is better than just being able to hear them. And it's certainly, these are better. Voice and vision is far superior to just that which we can put into one-dimensional writing. But there is no substitute for sitting together, being able to read one another's body language. Communication isn't just words. We make a terrible mistake when we think it's just words. It's the body language, it's reading one another, it's sensing what someone is intending to say. All of that means there's simply no substitute for face-to-face communication. And even face-to-face, with a mask on, it's not as good as with a mask off. There are so many cues, there's so many ways of knowing that we have that are so just instantaneous to us. We're not aware of that, but we miss a good part of just face-to-face communication when we're having to obscure what the lower half of the face looks like. So, you know, if in doubt, always, always, always go face-to-face.
And I think this next question picks up right where you left off. How do we meet people where they are, given the notion of alternative facts in market-driven information sets? We only seek out bias confirming contexts. We can't have conversations amongst ourselves and affect change. Taking the conversation to where they are is complicated when realities are selective now.
Well, that's true, but think of it this way. I remember once serving on a hospital board, and we decided we really needed to have someone from the constituency, from, you know, the typical communities that the patients came from, and this was an indigent care hospital. So, you know, we invited, you know, someone onto the board, and she came, and when she spoke, she didn't talk like the doctor. She didn't talk like the specialist. She didn't talk like the administrators. She talked like someone who lived just down the street. And I watched as some people simply listened to her and dismissed what she said because she wasn't talking in their language. She wasn't talking to them in college language. And when I say meet people where they are, it's listen for the meaning and don't expect them to talk in the language that is our language. It's, if we're going to meet people where they are, we must hear them also. And it's different. It's when a group of faculty invites students in for feedback, we need to listen astutely to what the students are saying, because their voices will be different from our argot, our just common language that we will use. It's different. We have to listen smarter to the spoken word.
I like that. Listen smarter. That's a great phrase. The next question we have here is, how can we address systemic racism without dismantling individual and institutional racism? Any thoughts?
We have to have our eyes open to it and be willing. It's kind of like Sisyphus. We just have to push that rock and continue pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And the racism plays out in different ways. So it's that awareness of the other, and it's the awareness of the life experiences that people have that are so different from others. I think so often of the difference between Black parents and white parents in this nation. White parents don't have to sit their adolescent down and say, it's time for me to talk to you about what's going to happen when the police, if you're driving and the police pull you over. It's different. And the talk that Black parents have to have is different from what white parents have to have. There's a whole subtext there of racism in that. It's as if you must take every single little block, every action, and say, is this unique to my experience? Is it unique to someone else's experience? And have a very open mind to that, and an embrace of the difference that is there, and an embrace of how intersectionalities really change life expectancies.
The next question is, how do you hire those considered other to diversity leadership teams without, 1, any open positions, and 2, no applicants from those demographics, even though advertising in very targeted focus areas?
And there's not an easy answer to that. If equity were easy, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. It's tough. It's tough because we each develop our own comfort zones and our own sort of systems of where we look for positions or where we advertise for positions. And it can be hard to find, but there are a number of ways to do this. One is to think of allies and advocates. And there's a good chance that allies and advocates also have outreach into other communities, and people can be brought in as guests. But let me just make this point, I'm seeing some faculty here that I know, and when I think of diversity, I think of all of the disappointments I have watched when searches have gone on. And the way we play this out in the academy is that we say all the right words, and then we will always interview, a candidate from, a background different from ours. And then we will criticize that candidate and say, well, but they're not publishing in blah, blah, blah journal. Or their research is interesting, but it's so minor. And all of a sudden we say, they're not a rafter in my architecture. Well, in fact, in their architecture, their work really matters. So we have to expand the canon, be willing to expand the canon, be willing to embrace research questions that aren't ours. And what you research determines where you publish. So if you're not publishing in the mainstream journals, what that simply means is you're not doing work that fits within that notion of what is normal research. And it's really kind of mind-bending to lean back and say, wait a minute, is this good research? And yes, maybe it is. And it may be very, very different from what I'm doing. But in fact, that's what diversifying faculties has to do. You have to diversify what you see as acceptable publication outlets, acceptable research questions to begin with. It's thinking more broadly, checking the rafters, and being so self-aware of what we have come to assume is simply the way things are.
That was a beautiful answer. I just gotta say that before I ask the next question. The next comment here is, working with white males in the classroom when covering this is a difficult topic where they already feel like they're being attacked. Or is there anything you want to add to that?
White males deserve social equity just like black males and black females and white females and Asian females and Asian males. If we are going to live together harmoniously, there has to be room for all of us. And there has to be room for our points of view. That's the way it has to be. That's the American dream. And I know that white men feel under attack, largely because they came of age and were born in a society where they were the entitled ones, where their architecture, their rafters gave them such certainty of their position. And it's when there's plenty of room at the dinner table, you have no problems inviting someone else to come and sit beside you. When that table gets really crowded, and in order to have them there, you've got to pull your elbows in, that doesn't feel good. That requires your own personal change. That's hard. That's hard. And that's what's going on with white males in our society. They're being asked to pull their elbows in. It's like, wow, this is a total change of rules. It's different. Living is hard. Living is hard. Getting along and accepting differences is hard. Change is hard.
Great answer. How can we hold decision makers accountable when we aren't in positions of power?
Well, that's hard. This is where groups really matter. Multiple voices speak louder than a single voice. So coalitions that form really help. Look at Black Lives Matter. The problems that it has exposed. Just look at the George Floyd killing. That's been going on for generations. But when there became a critical mass paying attention to it, then we gave it a name, and we're seeing communities create task forces, and we're seeing police chiefs who are very concerned about this, saying, how can I change this? So it's numbers matter. Numbers matter.
Why do you think that the concepts of equity and equitable outcomes are often negatively associated with the notion of socialism and radical left policies? And do you think it's appropriate to establish that narrative towards the concept of social equity?
Let me just hone in on the word narrative. I've been an academic for a long, long, long time. I love my spreadsheets. I love my regression coefficients. I love all my numbers. I feel like they give me some certainty. But in fact, they don't make any political difference. It's narratives that make the difference. It's narratives that cause people to feel good about government or to feel angry toward their government. It's the narratives. And how do we inject into narratives and make a change? That's a huge question that is paired with our being basically flummoxed with social media and very narrow wind tunnels of information. It's very hard now to get people to pay attention to points of view that they don't agree with. It is seductive to only listen and communicate with those whom we agree with. And when we do that, we isolate ourselves farther. How we're going to deal with the problem of wind tunnel media, I don't know, but it's the narrative that makes the difference. It's the narrative that has to change. It's the narrative that we as professors of public administration can talk to our students about, to have a story about harmonious diversity, living together in community, making room for everyone so that we can each be the best person we can be. It's the story that matters. And we have not done a good job in social sciences focusing on the story. We've done a really good job focusing on regression coefficients. But we've got to be smarter than that. We've got to use both sides of our brain if we're really going to advance social equity.
And right now we're getting to the last question I have here, so I expect a few more to roll in, possibly. But how do we market equity to those who don't believe inequality exists or think proposed solutions are too radical?
Well, you make the change where you can. Make the change where you can. It's, you know, if you're trying to dig a hole, you don't dig in the concrete. You dig around the edge of the concrete where things are malleable. You make the changes where you can and hope that through word of mouth and just persistent, consistent conversations and discourse that in fact you can change minds. It takes a long, long, long time. We didn't create these rafters that hold up this system overnight, and we won't tear them down and exchange them for other rafters overnight. It takes patience and persistence and talking to those who have a readiness to hear. What I'm delighted with, and it's what I say to so many people, is there's such a readiness now in this culture to pay attention to social equity. So we're jumping on that opportunity and hoping to expand it. And if the words become people's everyday language, that's how we move the narrative. That's how we create it in phrases and little pieces and showing one little piece of the joist that needs to be changed. Patience and persistence and little steps and celebrating partial victories.
Yeah, I have to make the point that progress wouldn't be a word with meaning if done were everything, right? If everything just flipped with a light switch.
If it were easy, we wouldn't even have to have this conversation. But it's not easy because it's behavior change. It's behavior change, and that's hard, and it is resistant. And it's especially resistant because we surround ourselves with people who think like we think. So that slows things down.
The next question. In terms of research, what are some areas you think related to social equity need more attention?
Look at whatever policy area you're interested in, whether it's public works or healthcare or space exploration, whatever policy area you work in, there will be equity components to it in terms of who is in leadership positions, whose voices matter, what the priorities are. Look hard at your own office, and all of a sudden, you'll start seeing the rafters. You will start seeing the support system that gives advantage to some and systematically disadvantages others.
Interestingly enough, Stacy's Avataro asked that question, and she's a very big space enthusiast. So it was a great answer. There's obviously a lot for us to do to improve social equity in our society. It seems overwhelming. Where do we begin?
You begin where you are. You begin where you are with the people around you, with the people you talk to, and you extend and expand, extend and expand. You start where you are. It's the only place you can start.
This next question actually builds up on that. Young people expect change overnight. How do we prepare them for the long haul?
How do you teach patience? Well,
And
let me tell you this. I've done quite a bit of international work and studied other cultures. And I've looked at ratings of the American culture compared to the Chinese culture and the Korean culture and the German culture and the Australian culture and so forth. Across all cultures, the Americans have the absolute shortest time horizons. Americans think soon means now. The Chinese think soon means within the next 5 years. I mean, it's time, perceptions of time and perceptions of what is reasonable for change to happen varies by culture. Americans are incredibly now oriented. And in fact, change doesn't happen now. It doesn't matter whether, we're talking about Gen Zs or back when I was, a teenager. It's every newest generation is incredibly impatient with the problems that the prior generations have left them and impatient with wanting change. But in fact, change is going to come slowly. It just is. So, we have to be smart enough to celebrate partial victories, be smart enough to celebrate when a little change happens, and that's a good thing because we still have to hold on to it. So is change going to happen overnight? Absolutely not. I mean, just look at it. I love politics, so I've been studying all of the aftermath of this last election, and it looked going into the election that there was going to be this huge blue wave, and there was not. Donald Trump was repudiated, but so was progressivism. We're in for a long, long slog.
Well, that actually concludes the list of questions. So I just want to ask, Dr. Guy, do you have any parting words that you'd like to say in the last couple minutes we have?
I think it's fine, friends. We're all in this together, and we're all in public affairs because we care about community. We care about the quality of life. We care about what happens in people's lives. And that's why social equity comes with in our work. Whether you are a budgeter and whether you are, delivering social services or teaching K-12, it doesn't matter. This comes with. And so we have to put it on our shoulders, always carry it there, be allies, be advocates, pay attention to it, and to the degree we can, re-examine our rules, take a look at the outcomes we're producing and ask ourselves, is this what we intend? Where can we make some changes? Who do we need to be listening to be smarter about what we're doing?
Wow. Well, I have to say, on behalf of the Center for Public and Nonprofit Management and the School of Public Administration at UCF, we're just really grateful that you spent your time with us today. You've given us really a lot to think about and a pretty big charge going forward that I'm really excited about. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Guy. This was really, really fantastic. And just to let everyone else know, we will get Dr. Guy's slides after this, and we will post them along with this video. So thank you again for joining us today. And thank you everyone else for joining us too.